As you know, I always seek to do the most topical articles and posts here on Geekerati, and this week I thought I'd be as up to date as possible with the latest controversies in role playing games by discussing the third superhero role playing game ever made, Supergame.
Hello and welcome to Geekerati.
For geeks, by geeks, and with geeks.
Life the level of the earth.
Welcome to Overtime.
Brave enough to do battle with hideous monsters?
I am Sinistar.
Hello and welcome to Geekerati. I'm Christian Lindke, and I'm here to talk about the superhero role-playing game Supergame, which was the third superhero role-playing game ever made. If you like this content and are interested in getting more of it, please like and subscribe. I can use all the followers I can get, and feel free to join me on the Geekerati Media Substack as well, where I have provided a written copy of this discussion, as well as a link to an Excel file I created that allows you to do the combat mechanics for the melee portion of Supergame's games. Last week on my Substack, I discussed an unpublished superhero game that I wish had been published and released by Wizards of the Coast in the mid-2000s. That game was called D20 Spectaculars and was based on the D20 Modern system. But today I'd like to follow that up with a bit of gaming history and a post about a truly unique superhero role-playing game and how I came to find a copy in the out-of-print bin at a local gaming store, a gaming store that has particular importance in the history of the role-playing game hobby. As I've mentioned many times before, I've been a fan of superhero role-playing games for as long as I can remember. My first experience with superhero gaming was with Hero Games' Excellent Champions 2nd Edition role-playing game. I was visiting a friend's house when I noticed he had a saddle-stitched copy of the game. It was a black and white cover, and it featured a super-powered battle featuring characters I'd never seen before. I hadn't recognized them from any comic book. So I asked my friend about the book, and he told me it was a superhero role-playing game called Champions, and he offered to let me borrow it, since we weren't currently playing any role-playing games and he was working on various projects in school at the time. I later learned that the black and white cover exists for both the 1st and 2nd edition of Champions, and that a true 1st edition of the Champions role-playing game has a wraparound color art cover that shows even more combatants. It has the 2 main combatants and then the allies of the hero on the back. The villain on the cover is named Holocaust, and you can see him there, which I only later learned in the 4th edition book, Classic Enemies. When that was released, it provided stats for him and a little bit of a discussion. And I believe the hero character is a character named Ice Star, who's one of the iconic characters of Champions, but he's not named on the cover, and no stats for Ice Star are provided within the Champions rulebook. In fact, the only stats I've ever seen in Champions for Ice Star are the statistics in the Champions comic book. So this is actually just guesswork that it's Ice Star, but I'm pretty certain that it is. And it was a very compelling cover. When I got the book home, I was amazed that game designers had even attempted to capture superheroes using game mechanics. At the time, I was only familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, Star Frontiers, Tunnels and Trolls, and the Fighting Fantasy game books, which were central to my gaming experience and my role-playing life, particularly Tunnels and Trolls and the Fighting Fantasy game books. I didn't have a lot of friends who were gamers, so those filled the gap and let me have time with role-playing games, at least in a simulated fashion, in addition to doing the other hobbies that I had. I played all 3 of those other games, and their mechanical foundations in no way, shape, or form prepared me for what Champions offered. Unlike these other games with which I was familiar, Champions did not have randomly created characters. Instead, it allowed you to build whatever you could imagine. The only limit to the character that you could design was the number of points available at creation. And in 1st edition Champions, it was 100 points, and in 2nd edition, it was 100 points plus 150 possible additional points if you took disadvantages. Other than that, it was all good. I hadn't seen games like Superhero 2044, which I reviewed in the past, or the Fantasy Trip, which included Melee and Wizard, yet, so I didn't know that there were other games that had point-based character creation. During my initial Champions experience, I didn't have anyone to play the game with. So I spent all my time making characters and doing some solo battles. The friend who loaned it to me wasn't playing role-playing games at the time. He was busy writing some computer programs and stuff, and he had loaned me the book. And I'd hoped that when summer came around, we'd get to play. My builds were heavily influenced by the sample characters in the rulebook, and thus were actually not even 250 point characters. They were 200 total character points, 100 points because that's the base number of points you get to spend, and 100 points from disadvantages that I gave to the characters. This included my personal write-ups for the X-Men, which were at the time my favorite comic book. I was content with my view of the game, but this view was to be shattered in short order. A couple of months after I discovered Champions, my family moved to a new city, and I finally encountered a group of gamers who played the game every weekend. Given that this was the Bay Area, it was in the Bay Area, and the game company was a Bay Area company, I soon discovered a rich and vibrant Champions community. I also discovered that how I interpreted character adaptations to the game was very different from other players. Some of that difference I maintain to this day. I personally believe that too many players, too many gamers, inflate the stats of their favorite characters out of love for the character, rather than an honest examination of the benchmarks and mechanics of the game. A lot of complaints I see from gamers when reviewing new superhero role-playing games is how the creators got so-and-so's stats wrong. Those same gamers might even like the mechanics of the game in general, but if the stats don't align with their preconceptions, they'll give the game a negative view. For me, I've never thought that that was fair. I saw the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game that was done by Cam Banks and a number of other people from Margaret Weiss Productions receive this complaint, and I've seen this for Matt Forbeck's new Marvel role-playing game. But the thing that I always come back to is you can make your own statistics for these characters that leverage the system in the way that you think the character should be represented. We're all going to have different interpretations of how a character should work, and if you don't agree with the basic interpretation that the game designer came up with, that's okay. That's fine. Do your own. It's your game and your setting. And don't think that the designer was trying to get things wrong. And if you can do it within the rules, then the rules themselves actually do work. Now, certainly, my early X-Men designs did not leverage the rules very well, because these are things that can only be understood through actual play. And that was something I had not done with Champions. When I finally got the chance to play the game, I learned how some combinations worked better than others. And I learned that other players were much more likely than I had ever imagined to use the grab option on obvious and accessible items that some characters used in combat. It really baffled me the first time I saw my friends playing the game. We encountered a villain who had a bow and was a kind of Green Arrow-ish villain. And the first thing one of the characters that one of my friends was playing did was grab for the bow. And upon succeeding, they completely took all of that character's capability of hurting us away. And that was something I hadn't even imagined. The game designers had. The option was in the game, my friends had, but it wasn't something I was thinking of. I was just thinking how making something obvious and accessible would make it cheaper, and thus you could have more powers. I hadn't designed a lot of characters of that type. The X-Men don't have a lot of obvious and accessible focused characters that are dependent on items. Rather, they have mutants that have inborn powers. I just had expected gamers to behave more like the characters in comic books, and less like tactical gamers who were focused on tactical advantage. And the rules of Champions definitely treat gamers as tactical gamers, even as they allow them to behave like the characters in the comic books. Long story short, I learned that you can only truly judge the quality of a game by playing it. You can read the rules all day, but it is the on-the-table experience with other gamers that lets you know really how and why a game works. I still love Champions, and I think it's one of the top 3 or 4 superhero games in existence. But my view is now grounded in experience of how the game works, and how when some character building norms take over the game, it can slow down significantly, and the game can lose some of its initial charms. My love of superheroes and superhero role-playing games led me to purchase Villains and Vigilantes, Marvel Superheroes, and DC Heroes, all of which have their charms. Eventually, I came across a game called Supergame. It's an early superhero role-playing game designed by Jay Hartlove and Amy Kirkland. It wasn't the first superhero game ever published. That was Superhero 2044, or Superhero 44. It wasn't the second. That was Villains and Vigilantes first edition. But it was one of the first, and it predates Champions, and that's an important distinction because of many of the things that it does. Both the first and second edition of Supergame came out in the same year. They came out in 1980. I became aware of Supergame initially as some kind of mythic artifact that I wasn't even sure existed because I'd read an article about it in Different Worlds magazine, number 23. That magazine issue is probably the most important issue of a gaming magazine ever published in the role-playing game hobby on the topic of superhero role-playing games. Even though I knew there was a real game because they discussed it in that issue, I never thought I'd be lucky enough to find a copy to examine. But that all changed when I discovered the game as a real artifact, and not as something mentioned only in old gaming magazines when I moved to Los Angeles after graduating from college in 2000. I was looking for gaming stores and found a long-standing gaming store in Long Beach called The Warhouse, and it had a copy of the first edition of Supergame. And to give you an experience of what I did, I actually literally, when I moved to Los Angeles, I drove all around Los Angeles County from game store to game store to game store, which had kind of a dual effect. I learned where every game store was, what kind of selection they had, and I learned that the Warhouse and Aero Hobbies in Santa Monica were probably two of the best game stores ever in creation. And the other thing I did is I learned a lot about Los Angeles geography, so I was able to find my way around. But anyway, after finding this first edition copy of Supergame, I found out, due to later searches on the internet, that I got a significant bargain on it. I essentially paid cover price. I did the same with copies of Warlock and a couple of other games that were originally designed by the Southern California gaming community. The Warhouse was the home of Balboa Games, and Balboa Games is who published the Warlock role-playing game, aka Tech D&D. I'm also pretty sure that the Warhouse is where John Eric Holmes took the photographs of him playing D&D for his book Fantasy Role-Playing Games. I seem to remember the chalkboard-covered table being in the back room there, but memories are odd things, and Holmes played at both the Warhouse and at Aero Hobbies, so it could have been either location. But on to the review. Supergame, like Superhero 2044, which predates it, and Champions, which comes after it, has a point-based character creation system. It also has an interesting skill and combat system that I think has a lot of potential. Just like Superhero 2044 before it, some of the stats, though, are odd in how they're presented. For example, if a character has an agony score, and this is similar to what's called stun in Champions, or hit points if you didn't die when you lost them in D&D, a character who has an agony score of 10 or more has no penalties to any action. They can move or act normally. But in Champions, stats start at the average number, which in Champions is also 10. In Supergame, they start at 0. And given that the scores start at 0, and that some of the sample characters have 0 in other statistics, it implies that 0 is sometimes, but not always, the average score. And it seems odd that a person has to spend points just to be an average person in some areas and not others. I would rather have the baseline for a character be without any penalty rather than to start with penalties and build up without them, because you're eating into points that are given as free in the character creation. Instead, I would ask, why not just have the stats start at average and let people buy them down later if they want to have some kind of penalty? Or why not have average agony start at 0 with no penalties and allow negative scores to cause the impairment? It's a small complaint. There are a number of neat features in the game, like different defenses against different types of attack. Remember, this is pre-Champions. A thorough reading of the rules, both editions, and the supplements has convinced me that this is a game I really need to play to get the full evaluation of and actually to enjoy. Because every time I read it, I find new things that I think will work and make an excellent game. And that evaluation will let me know whether the designed characters that they have in the rule books and in Different Worlds number 23 are effective at all in a way that would be fun to play. There are far more characters in the rule books that have an agony of 10 or a physical score, which is like hit points, but with those who have a score of less than 10 once again beginning injured, which means that if they only suffer 1 point of damage, they'll be impaired again. This oddity leads me to wonder how much they play tested it, although it does seem that they play tested it a lot based on other things. Since Wayne Shaw's expanded Superhero 2044 character design rules were printed in a fanzine called Lords of Chaos in 1979, it seems likely to me that those, along with Superhero 2044, influenced the character creation rules of Supergame, in particular because, once again, you have these stats that start at some form of impairment, which is true in Superhero 2044, but isn't true in any of the other games, particularly the only other superhero game that existed at the time, Villains and Vigilantes, has nothing like that. But the overlap in some of the combat mechanics of Supergame and Superhero 2044 make me think that the connection's even stronger than just the character design system. Take, for example, the ranged combat system. Superhero 2044 has an extraordinarily unique ranged combat system, one that I've only ever seen in one other published game. Under the rules for projectile attacks in Superhero 2044, it states the following. Projectile attack includes energy bolts and rays, force beams, gases, as well as bullets and grenades. To hit the target, use the transformation attack procedure. When a hit occurs, its location on the body is found, and endurance and vigor points are removed. But what is the transformation attack procedure? It's simple, but this is that unique system that I'm talking about. And it's distinct from the melee combat system in Superhero 2044. Instead of comparing statistics and getting a target number, transformation attacks work like this. Transformation. This is an attempt to change the defender into some kind of object through magic, super technology, or some unique power. Transformation may be to stone, ice, an animal, or may mean phasing out. It may also include making something heavier or lighter to cause the effect to occur, and this is where it gets really interesting. The attacker rolls a six-sided die, modifies that rolled number according to the transformation modification table. And then, when they get that target number, they roll another six-sided die, attempting to match or better that modified number. Whether a character hits their opponent with a transformation attack or in ranged combat is decided by rolling a six-sided die, adding and subtracting to the die total some applicable modifiers. This sets a target number that must be rolled, that number or higher, on a second roll of a six-sided die. While the modifications for a transformation attack are limited to the species or material that make up the target, with inanimate objects being the easiest to transform, ranged combat has a long list of modifiers. As you can see, it's a long list of modifiers. In Superhero 2044, a character with a 20 dexterity gets a -1 bonus. Shooting an opponent at point-blank range, a -3 bonus. With a shoulder weapon, -1. If they roll a 6 on a six-sided die, that gives them a modified result of 1. They have the 6, -1 for dexterity, -3 for point-blank range, and -1 for shoulder weapon. And that means that the character hits if they roll a 1 or better on a second roll. This system, with some difference in the modifier values between the two editions, Supergame and Superhero 2044 have different modifier values, is the exact same system that's used in Supergame. Let's take a look at the description from Supergame for weapons combat, which is specifically regarding weapons that strike from a distance. These tables are used to determine whether a hit has been scored by any weapon that strikes from a distance and must be aimed. The damage done if a hit is scored depends on the destructive potential of the attack and the resilience of the target. The following tables are modifiers that are particular to each attack made. Roll a six-sided die. Modify as below. Then roll another six-sided die. For the attack to score a hit, the second roll must be greater than the modified first roll. This must be done for each attack made. That's roll a d6, modify it to create a target number, then to roll again. It's the exact same system as Superhero 2044, and it is the only game other than Superhero 2044 I've ever seen that uses that system. I've looked many times in war games to see if this is a system that originated in some war game outside of my own personal play experience, but I've never found it. I've never found a system that's roll a d6, modify it, that sets a target number, which you then roll another d6 to exceed. The specific modifications between the two games are not identical, as you can see, different modifiers, but they are, as the saying goes, close enough for government work. Of particular interest is the use of the shoulder weapon and braced weapon categories. To me, the Supergame system looks like a heavily playtested and modified version of Superhero 2044 when it comes to ranged combat. One that turned a loose set of rules into a consistent but thought out one. From what I can see, though, Superhero 2044 wasn't the only game to influence Supergame's combat systems. The melee combat system echoes elements of Runquest / basic role-playing's resistance table, which in that game compares intensities in order to create a percentage likelihood of success. Where Runquest uses a skill system with percentile-based proficiency by weapon or weapon category for melee combat, it uses a comparison table for the effectiveness of poisons and magical effects on individuals, where you would compare the intensity of those poisons or magical spells to a statistic to get the percentage chance that a character can resist that effect. For a free-form superhero role-playing game, though, having a long list of individualized attacks with different percentage chances to hit might work, and it certainly does for Superworld, which is the official basic role-playing based superhero game. But it's reasonable to think that in a pre-Superworld world, you might come up with an idea that a broader system might be more flexible. And I think that Supergame used that resistance table from the basic roleplay system as the foundation for its hand-to-hand combat system. The basic to-hit chance in Supergame's melee combat system compares opponents' dexterity scores to come up with a percentage chance to hit. And on my Substack account, I've included an Excel file that calculates the chance to hit for later use, as well as I'm about to provide you with some of the appropriate text from the rulebook below, and a table for basic role-playing. But in Supergame, it says all hand-to-hand combat is done by comparing modified dex scores of the attacker and defender for each blow initiated using the universal comparison ratio. And what this is the percentage chance of success equals the attacker's total divided by the attacker's total plus the defender's total times 100%. If you have your comparison in units of 5, just like on the basic roleplay chart, going 5, 10, 15, 20, they're not identical because the system does work around the edges a little bit, but you can see how it's very Runquestian in nature. By comparing Supergame systems to those in Superhero 2044 and basic roleplay, I'm not trying to diminish the creativity and work that went into designing the game. I feel exactly the opposite of critical when it comes to this game system. I greatly admire what Jay and Amy did here. They demonstrate a broad knowledge of role-playing games at the time, those that were in publication, and a familiarity not with just published games, but the active zine community and the active gaming community, in particular the California gaming community. When I published an earlier discussion of Supergame on social media a few years back, Jay Hartlove was kind enough to respond and provide some further context for the development of the game. And what he said was, I believe we were the first to crack the superhero nut with build-it-yourself points. All the different physics and magics that come with superheroes required combat and armor systems that would universally fit whatever folks dreamed up, hence the armor classes. And he agreed that we should have included baselines for certain statistics. Now here I'm going to give a little bit of pushback but also agree. Wayne Shaw had come up with some point-based rules for character design for Superhero 2044. But they hadn't really quite balanced everything perfectly. And I think that what Jay and Amy did was far more balanced and took those things into consideration, and was the first one, as he said, to crack the walnut and reveal how powerful a build-it-yourself point system could be in the superhero environment. Back to what Jay was saying. I agree with your observation that tactical gamers will find ways to get more out of the rules, sometimes to the result of bending the original flavor of the genre. Finding a loophole in a set of rules that makes the Hulk more powerful with a hammer does not mean he should start carrying around a hammer all the time. That's where the stingy points come in. You want to carry a hammer around all the time? Then you pay points for the hammer. That's because that's what you always take into battle. It's up to DMs to enforce the fair use of points, and therefore character effectiveness. There's only so much that a designer can do on that, and I think he's right. Absolutely. Back to Jay. Oh, and speaking of points, don't forget the experience and growth concept, which was also a first, and certainly the way they do character point growth by character points in Supergame. It's the first time that I remember seeing that being used as the experience system. The history of when these games were created matters too, back to Jay. The folks who designed Champions came to LA and played Supergame with me in Santa Monica several times. I knew they were developing their own game. I wasn't in it for the money. I was happy to share ideas so gamers could get better and better games. I was a bit naive, but I'm glad the guys at Hero Games found a way to take some of my ideas and add their own to create a game that sold better and expanded awareness of superheroes and RPGs better than Supergame ever could have. He said thanks again and happy gaming. To be fair to Jay, Champions definitely benefited from having the Origins convention held in the Bay Area the year it was released. That was a big deal. Origins was a fairly large convention at the time. It's still a fairly large convention, though now it no longer wanders across the United States to different cities as it did in the 1970s and 1980s. More important, though, Aaron Alston's articles in Space Gamer really launched Champions into national attention. While Amy Karkland's artwork in Supergame is not bad, it's significantly better than anything I could do, and I am quite fond of it. It's at about the same level as two of the three primary artists in the first edition of Champions. Supergame could have benefited from a Mark Williams being there too. An illustrator of that caliber would have elevated their game that much more. And really, the elevation between first and second edition, the first edition having little rivets in it and the second edition being staple bound, was a significant increase in production quality and on a quick turnaround. I am impressed with what Jay and Amy were able to put together. What's of note here in what Jay said was he mentioned playing Supergame with the Champions crew in Santa Monica. Given that Jay and Amy were regulars in the Game at Arrow Hobbies, as Amy's inclusion as an artist and player in the Manual of Arania attests, and the Manual of Arania is one of the old mythic documents of D&D play, this places Supergame in a wonderful connection with the Thief class for the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game. Gary Schweitzer was the owner of Arrow Hobbies and a huge proponent of Runquest, and was an advocate every time I went there to get me to buy Runquest products. Eventually, he actually converted me to it. But he was also the person who shared the Thief class that Daniel Wagner created with the world. It was his phone call to Gary Gygax talking about his friend Daniel having created the Thief class that led Gary Gygax to create a Thief class for D&D based on that description. It must have been amazing to play with that Southern California gaming group. I think there's an extraordinarily good game buried in the Supergame rulebooks, but I think it's a game that needs a lot of playtesting and rules tweaks to bring out that game for the modern gaming audience. I think that the gaming community in the late 70s, early 80s, maybe even into the 90s, was far more used to rules having huge gaps in them that the DMs filled in for themselves. Modern gamers really like games to be fully playtested, and I think given that role-playing games are a 50-year-old hobby now, that's not an unrealistic expectation. My point here is that I really would like to see this done with Supergame. You can currently purchase the original and second edition of the game at DriveThruRPG, and I'll provide a link for that below. Precis Intermedia Games reprinted the game a few years back with a very high quality scan. The PDF includes both the first and second edition of the rules. Brett, the owner of Precis Intermedia Games, got his copy of the second edition for the reprint from Jay Hartlove, but he got the copy of the first edition from me. It was my personal copy, and he treated it extraordinarily kindly as he scanned it for the project. And I'm glad that he did, because I think of it as an extraordinary, unique item. Supergame is an important game. It moved forward the point-based character design and was one of the major games when it came to the shift from completely random characters to characters that are created with player intent in order to design the character type that we wanted to play. What's a superhero role-playing game or other role-playing game that you think has been too long overlooked? Share that with me in the comments below, or visit my Substack and engage in the conversation. Please like and subscribe to this video, and visit the Substack and like and subscribe there as well. Until next time, I'm Christian.
Shall we play a game?
This geek of technology.
He's a Highlander, by God.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play.